So the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, is apparently ready for World War III, saying nothing is ruled out, including using Western troops to stop Russia winning the Ukraine war. French President Emmanuel Macron has openly discussed the possibility of sending European troops to Ukraine to help Kiev win the war against Russia, a potential major escalation to the largest ground war Europe has seen since World War II. Though the possibility of Western democracies putting boots on the ground in Ukraine remains remote, Macron's comments following a summit in support of Ukraine prompted a hawkish response from the Kremlin and sent European leaders scrambling to backtrack. Macron is the ultimate Eurocrat who wants to build a gay European imperium. This reaction by Macron, this whole situation, is also part of why you could see Nikki Haley going scorched earth on Trump. Everything Nikki Haley does is ultimately about Ukraine. Her donors are using her as a puppet to voice their concern that Trump will not be supportive enough of Ukraine, and their anxiety that the Ukraine aid bill is still in limbo. This is also probably part of why the Ukraine war has been going the way it has, at the pace it's been going, because Putin could be holding off for this precise scenario. He doesn't want to appear too aggressive and potentially instigate a military conflict with NATO, which some Eurocrats are champing at the bit to initiate. There is probably some sort of behind-the-scenes handshake agreement because, for one, Ukraine does not do land operations into Russia, and Russia is currently only expanding into Ukraine from other parts of Ukraine that it has already occupied. It's not, there's all this border that they could invade from. They could also invade through Belarus, but they've decided not to. They're only focusing on this particular area right now, which leads me to believe that there's probably some sort of agreement going on where behind the scenes they've agreed with some Western powers, some Western officials, not to invade from those places anymore, at least not anymore. A NATO official told CNN the alliance had no plans to deploy combat troops in Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who attended the meeting in Paris on Monday, said that while there was a good debate and detailed discussion on the topic, summit participants were unanimous in their opinion against deploying troops, although Macron is definitely excited for it. Macron had told reporters at a news conference that while he and the other 21 European leaders present did not agree on deploying military personnel, the prospect was discussed openly. Quote, "Nothing should be ruled out," end quote, he said. Quote, "We will do anything we can to prevent Russia from winning this war," end quote. However, a raft of European officials came out on Tuesday against such a plan. Among them were some of Ukraine's more ardent supporters, including the United Kingdom, Poland, Spain, and Italy, as well as officials from Hungary and Slovakia, two countries whose leaders have been criticized as pro-Russian. Quote, "What was agreed among ourselves and with each other from the very beginning also applies to the future, namely that there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil sent there by European countries or NATO states," end quote, said Scholz. Macron did, however, announce that a new coalition would be created to supply Ukraine with medium-range and long-range missiles. Quote, "We're at a critical moment in this conflict that requires us to take the initiative," end quote, Macron said. With $60 billion worth of American funding for Ukraine held up by Republicans in Congress, the burden has shifted to Europe to help arm Ukraine as it attempts to fend off a resurgent Russian military. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines say they are already running low on ammunition, which has cost them on the battlefield. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told CNN in a recent interview that millions could die if Washington fails to supply his country with more aid. What a usual story. The European Union has already committed more than $150 billion in aid to Ukraine, but sending in troops would be a drastic step, one that was unthinkable when Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion 2 years ago. Macron pointed out that Western democracies have gradually increased their support to levels unthinkable when the war began. That's not a good thing. He highlighted the example of Germany, which offered helmets and sleeping bags to Kiev at the outset of the conflict, and is now saying more needs to be done to supply the country with missiles and tanks. Quote, the people that said never ever today were the same ones who said never ever planes, never ever long-range missiles, never ever trucks. They said all that 2 years ago, end quote. He said, quote, we have to be humble and realize that we have always been 6 to 8 months late, end quote. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Tuesday that such a deployment in Ukraine would put the West in conflict with Moscow. Quote, in this case, we need to talk not about the likelihood, but about the inevitability of a conflict, end quote, Peskov said. Quote, these countries must also assess and be aware of this, asking themselves whether this is in their interests, as well as the interests of the citizens of their countries, end quote. Kremlin officials have made similar comments in the past. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said last year that the U.S., the United Kingdom, and many others are, quote, waging war, end quote, against Russia and are engaged in hostilities against the country by supplying Ukraine with assistance. In hosting Monday's summit and committing to such a strong defense of Ukraine, Macron appears to be attempting once again to assert himself as the symbolic leader of a united Europe as the continent braces for the possibility of former U.S. President Donald Trump winning a second term. Given Trump's antipathy toward NATO and transactional view towards alliances, leaders like Macron have stressed that the burden must fall to Europe to protect itself from any future Russian aggression. There are a lot of bureaucrats out there who view America as unreliable and want to build, as I said earlier, their own independent gay European imperium, which does not have to rely on the U.S. for self-defense purposes. Macron warned at the start of the summit that Russia would likely attack beyond Ukraine in the coming years, threatening Europe's collective security. Quote, this is a European war, end quote, Macron said. Quote, it's our soil and our continent, end quote. Macron also signaled he was willing to abandon his long-standing opposition to buying arms for Ukraine from outside the EU for Ukraine. The French president had been against purchasing weapons outside the bloc to support an EU initiative known as strategic autonomy, bureaucratic jargon for a series of policies aimed at making Europe less reliant on the U.S. and other international partners in matters of foreign and defense policy. While Macron's apparent shift on non-EU weapons acquisition may seem in conflict with Europe's drive for self-sufficiency, it is more likely a reflection of how badly European arms stockpiles have been hit by the war in Ukraine. As long as a year ago, officials were warning that supplying Ukraine had left nations desperately short of a wide range of weapons. The urgent need to do this as soon as possible means that buying exclusively within the EU simply isn't realistic. Region-wide drops in defense spending following the end of the Cold War led to arms manufacturers reducing their ability to make such weapons, and rebuilding the industry won't happen overnight. This meant that Europe didn't only need to, quote, refill its own cupboard, but build a new cupboard and fill that too, end quote, one European official told CNN last week. Macron's change of heart, however, doesn't necessarily mean that he is moving on from strategic autonomy. It remains a long-term goal, but rearming Kiev is a short-term necessity. It's also worth noting that there is no precise end point to strategic autonomy, and many European officials have shifted on what the exact role of the U.S. should be in European security and to what extent NATO should be the broker in that, rather than the EU. But by arranging the meeting where this new short-term approach was agreed, Macron can still claim to be leading the charge on bolstering Europe's new, more assertive and independent foreign policy. Still, even within France, Macron's comments have proved controversial. Various opposition lawmakers criticized the comments on Tuesday, saying a French deployment would constitute belligerence, though Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu insisted that, quote, to say that we exclude nothing is neither weak nor escalatory, end quote. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon both reiterated that President Joe Biden had ruled out sending U.S. troops to fight in Ukraine. Quote, certainly every country is free to speak to its own interest, but in addition to the president making clear that the U.S. will not send troops to fight in Ukraine, the NATO Secretary General has ruled out any NATO troops to fight in Ukraine, end quote, said State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at a press briefing. Pentagon spokesman Major General Pat Ryder added, just to be clear, we have no plans to send U.S. service members to fight in Ukraine. So I think Macron ultimately wants to invade. He wants a strong EU. He wants to build this liberal European superstate, which is muscular. And he also can't do that with Europeans because, generally speaking, they're too soft. So this is part of why he's pro-immigration, so he can bring in a bunch of third worlders. Although I think he recently, at least publicly, changed his position on that in order to suit the opinions and sentiments of the general French public who don't want any more immigrants. But the Eurocrats are in favor of bringing in more immigrants in order to basically serve various purposes that they have, probably wanting a lot of them to fight in their armies so they can have a strong and independent Europe, which is free from being under the influence of the U.S. Europe is soft. Actual native Europeans willing to fight for their countries are quite few, and who can blame them because they've been demonized by their governments and European media, similar to how people here in the U.S. are demonized. So Europe needs to outsource it, it's really cope to say otherwise. So Eastern Europeans or third worlders or America has to do Europe's dirty work for it. As stated in the article, Europe's militaries have been chronically underfunded for the past 30 to 35 years, really since the end of the Cold War. So Western Europe very much has this sensitivity, very much has these concerns toward Russia, despite what some nationalists from various Western European countries will try to tell you. But the silver lining to the whole situation is that there's still a lot of inertia and resistance to Macron's proposal, even among some Eurocrats, because it's just so threatening. Like, it's just such an escalation. And you see Macron trying to kind of get his foot in the door, saying that, oh, people were saying that sending supplies from Europe was never ever, and now we did that, so then we can do this. But like, it's really like, this is a very serious situation, and thankfully, even among the sort of independent, strong EU as its own super state camp, there are people who are not willing to go this far to attempt to preserve and defend that idea. Anyway, that's it for this video. Please give it a like and share it. That is the #1 way you can support this channel. Also, hop in the Discord if you're interested. It is wide open for the moment, and we are looking for more people. And that will be the end of this video, and Red Channels will catch you in the next one.